Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So we're going to work through a couple of questions that you all shared during the panel conversation. So we'll get to hear some more from our panelists on their perspectives to questions that you've shared with us. Without further ado, if we get the panel back. Amazing. So impressive. You're all still here. So we have a bunch of questions sort of piling up from people that have been watching as you've spoken, and I think some of them speak to a lot of the, I don't know, the ways that we're seeing some of these challenges too. And I think there's no right answer to a lot of these, but I'd love to hear your perspective on some of them. And we can start with someone's question around how we sequence AI and regulation. So AI can move quickly, and technical development can move apace in a way that can make it difficult to appropriately regulate. And I'm wondering, I mean, I feel like Corey, this question was made for you, but to the others as well. Sort of, what does it look like to effectively regulate technical systems so that we ensure transparency and accountability? Particularly on issues of huge importance that have direct connection to human rights and life, liberty, and equality, as the questioner put it. So, who has thoughts on sort of how do we deal with this inherent tension or perceived tension between the speed of technical development and the desire to regulate it effectively? Corey, go.
I think the first answer is to say that we've actually already got some pretty good laws on the books, and the idea that AI or other kind of algorithmic technologies are so different from anything that's come before that the law can't possibly apply is just hogwash. It's not true. Actually, what the government ought to do is observe and comply with the laws that we currently have. So, to take it out of the grading context, for example, and to give a different story from the other case that Foxglove won in August, the Home Office for 5 years or so has had an algorithm that it used to process every single visa application to the United Kingdom. So millions upon millions of people's rights to see their family members, to go to weddings, to go to funerals, to study, determined in part by an algorithm that gave you a kind of traffic light risk score, green, yellow, and red. And within that system that was built, by the way, no neural net. We're talking about one step up from a spreadsheet here. So technically, actually relatively simplistic. They had a list of undesirable nations that simply because you came from a certain country, overwhelmingly likely, by the way, to be a non-white country, you were more likely to be streamed high risk red and therefore denied a visa. That fact of your being denied a visa meant that the country you came from was more likely then, as a policy matter, to stay on the list of high risk nations. And there was a kind of doom loop in the algorithm that they had set up. We said that just straight up violated the Equality Act. So we didn't need some kind of fancy new AI specific statute. It was just that the technical system as rolled out did not comply with the laws that they had. And I think there's been, as I said before, too little critical attention given to the compliance of the systems with the laws that we've got. Some of the laws we have are perfectly good.
Yeah. Others want to chime in on that when thinking about good policy, good implementation of existing policy, and just generally how government should be thinking about regulation and AI?
If I can chime in, I
Yeah.
think so. As Corey said, there's clearly that we already have some pretty good basic legal rights and protections. I think probably the next level down is to make sure that we've got good processes in place when government designs algorithms, and I think a good way to do that is more nimble, quicker to do than regulation is through something like standards. So this is where standard setting, putting together a set of standards for the government use of algorithms could be quite effective. It's quicker to update. It's something that people can sign up to, and it has some codification. So it's not just a kind of something that will be debated out and argued, but at the same time, it's kind of not trying to legislate for everything because, as Corey said, we've actually got some of that stuff pretty firmly in place already.
Interesting. And Sophie, do you have thoughts on standards or more broadly, sort of this question?
Yeah, and I think the last part I would just make is, although, I mean, yes, so technical development can seem to happen often quite quickly, but actually, a lot of the time in my experience, it's not that fast. It's just that it often happens outside of the remit of kind of general conversation. And I think within the technical development process, there is room for a lot more conversation about the effects that the AI algorithms that are developed or other kinds of technical development happens, the effects that they can have on people at large. The problem is just that those conversations aren't really happening enough. It's not that technical development is necessarily happening at a speed that makes it impossible.
Yeah, interesting. I also imagine sometimes there's um, an incentive to overestimate the extent to which things are moving quickly, and they're all whizzy, and it's all going to make things better. So just trust us. Corey, did you want to jump in again?
I'd also dissent from the proposition that regulation stifles innovation. I think that's a false binary that gets set up all the time, as happened, by the way, in the automobile industry a few decades ago. They basically said, look, if you put in more stringent safety standards, it's going to kind of kill the car. We're not going to be able to do what we're doing now. And then, of course, comes the 3-point safety seatbelt, then comes Volvo, then comes a whole area of market competition where actually the safer a vehicle was, possibly the more sellable it was. And I think we need to be thinking about that with respect to some of these data practices, that actually it may open up a different kind of innovation, either in the policy space or in the private sector.
Yeah, creativity doesn't just stem from lack of accountability, I think, as well. But yeah, that's super interesting. So another question that I think is a really interesting one, and sort of on the back of that one, how can we ensure, if, and this is a question sort of I'm directly quoting, how can we ensure that this doesn't erode trust in algorithms that have a positive impact on society? So sort of getting at that question of trust, and that in an environment that lacks trust, the idea that you can use these tools in good ways is undermined. What are our thoughts on that? Sort of how do we deal with this trust gap, and should we? And yeah, what are your thoughts?
I guess the first thing, if I can jump in, I'd say is I have a feeling it's already eroded quite a lot on the trust that people have on algorithms, which in a way is a shame. I think in the long run, making it clear to people exactly what processes will be put in place in the future to avoid the kinds of problems that we've seen already is very important. But then the other thing that I've been thinking about is a lot of the time in technology, we'll use these terms like AI, algorithms, and they're all very vague, and it's not necessarily clear what we're talking about in the first place. And it has the effect of often making these things sound like they're very difficult to understand, like they're not things, like they're very complicated, maybe they can read your mind, stuff like that. And really what we need is a lot more transparency about what we're often talking about when we talk about algorithms and AI. Very often we're talking not about very complicated techniques in the first place. And we need to be a lot more transparent and a lot more clear about what statistical methods we're using and why, in a way that the population at large can understand.
Yeah, Stian?
I mean, I agree. I think some of the language that's been used about this, like, a mutant algorithm caused all these problems, is really unhelpful, because it wasn't the fact that an algorithm was used that caused the problems. It was the choices that were made about what the statistical method should prioritize, about the process for how that would be handled, and how the errors would be picked up. And those are problems that are related to an algorithmic process, but they're human decisions. That's the problem. And I think one way that we can prevent this from unfairly eroding trust in algorithms in general is by sort of testifying, by being really clear that this is about what actually happened and what caused the problems.
Yeah. Corey, any thoughts on that one?
+1 to all of that. It doesn't make any more sense to say that it's undermining algorithms any more than to say, well, it's undermined trust in spreadsheets, right? I mean, that's just a tool that a human uses. And let's say that there is one that you want to use for a socially beneficial purpose, which we accept absolutely could be the case. All you've got to do is make that case to the people, right? That say, look, this is what we're trying to do. This is what we value. This are the trade-offs that we make. This is how it works. And this is how we're going to check that it works how we think it works. If you can answer those questions in plain English to people, then it doesn't seem to me that it should be impossible, even in the teeth of this fiasco, to generate political will for one or another kind of system.
Yeah, and it feels sometimes like we talk about whether we trust the algorithm rather than do we trust the policymakers that are making the decisions about how and if and when it should be deployed. To Stian's point about the human decisions that go into building these systems. Another question that we haven't really touched on. I mean, we've mentioned it a little bit, but someone asked sort of how this crisis would affect the mental health of those affected, and I recognizing that none of us are young people that have recently taken our A levels and can't speak directly to our personal experiences. I'm wondering if you all have thoughts, either Corey, from the students that you talk to, or if others have family members or sort of people that they've been able to discuss this with, in terms of how we're seeing the fallout from this in terms of mental health.
It is a system that is determining everybody's life chances, of course. I think it can always feel bad when you're disappointed with your grade. And I imagine that people in a normal year are disappointed with their grade, and that it's a very fraught moment for a lot of people, and a disappointing moment in the usual run. But then to have as an overlay on that, sorry, actually, your life, you thought it was going this way, and actually you just had a major swerve, and you're not going to be a doctor after all. You're not going to get to go to that university after all. Because of the policy decision we've made to limit a one-time uptick in grade inflation, you're going to, I mean, it's obvious that that was going to hurt people and be deeply, deeply offensive to them. And of course, we had people just writing us saying, what do I do? What do I do? How do I fix it? And to them, right, it looked, at least at the beginning, it's easy to say, well, it's better now for the vast majority of people, but at the beginning, it just looked like government was this kind of monolith, and that they had no purpose, no way to go. They didn't understand what was meant to be the appeal. It made no sense to them. And so it just looked for a minute as if their future had been kind of totally written off. So they were deeply traumatized by these things.
Yeah. Also, the taking us back to the quotes I read out at the beginning, in terms of Larissa Kennedy and Atienne Akek talking about talking at a systems level, but also talking as individuals that experience that, and just the words like chaos, the words like anxiety, the words like systemic racism, the words like classism. It's very clearly impacting them at a level that's of course, they're, I think, being super helpful analytically and structurally, and thinking about, what's good for all students, but that you can hear the pain in the way that even these campaigners are talking about the situation. And I think that's just really important to remind ourselves of, and also recognize, Corey, to your point during our conversation on the panel, that where else are these systems being deployed in ways that we're having mental health fallout that we might not see, because either it's not on the front page of newspapers, or because communities that are experiencing it don't often get heard by either the government or the public. So just to sort of, I think it's a great question, just to like bring it back to the human effects that these systems have, and it's not a math exercise; it's a very human one. And then we have a sort of a broad question that I think is, it kind of ties together a lot of the conversations we've been having, but I think it pops it up a level, and thinking about what kind of policy making and oversight do we need in government generally. I'll try and help us narrow it a little bit, and think about these types of systems, and maybe this moment with COVID, and Corey, to your recent point about the fact that this is an anomalous year in some senses, and so building systems that attempt to pretend that it's all normal probably isn't going to get us where we need to go. But what does oversight look like when the government is attempting to be creative and innovative in such an unprecedented moment? It's a tough question. I'll bring us back a little bit to this idea that it can't be governance by news cycle. It can't be opaque, and sort of behind the scenes, a government is trying to build this magical tool that's going to get them out of a political crisis and a really atypical, complex situation. But are there other sort of thoughts on what oversight should look like in this moment, when at some level we're all rooting for the government to do a fantastic job this year, and we want them to succeed given the complexity of the situation, but how do we connect that to a process of checks and balances and accountability and oversight? Stian, do you have ideas?
So I think we kind of need to try and create accountability in as many ways, well, in a number of ways, to kind of take a sort of belt and braces approach to it. I think the first thing is to create a presumption of transparency around the design of algorithms, because one of the risks of algorithmic processes is that they can create black boxes. To counteract that, you need to have something where it is the government's default is to be open about the design, even if under certain circumstances you might then sort of say, okay, well, there is something about this that we can't be public about. But that was obviously not what happened here, and in a sense that was probably partly because we were coming at this from the world of exams, where confidentiality is kind of people's lifeblood. You know, if you're dealing with exam papers, you keep them secret. That's kind of that. So people's sort of professional default is that. But if you have an actual default that's openness, I think that would help a lot. I think the second thing is to create a kind of professional culture so that the individual people within government who are working on this can make sure their concerns are addressed. And actually, we have kind of, that is what processes and standards within government are actually pretty good at doing. They're about creating a way for the individuals who are working on these systems to have something they can appeal to make sure that the right thing is done. That's why, for example, we have like a green book to make sure public financial decisions are made in a responsible way. We kind of need the same sort of thing for people who are working on algorithms. And then I guess that sits within this overarching framework of law, where we want law to make that underpins individuals' rights and anti-discrimination, so that ultimately this stuff is all is legally underwritten and has judicial review as a final backstop if all else fails.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's helpful. Any other thoughts on oversight and accountability aside from what we've already said?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a more broad level, imagining what I would want as a student back when I was taking exams, I really wouldn't want to have felt like the decision about my future was being made as a political decision. And I think it kind of emphasizes the need to ensure that there are bodies outside of the government that are involved in consulting every step of the way. Because, you know, I mean, it really doesn't seem fair that the decision should be made not really about what's right for me and for the other students, but on the basis of more of a political context.
Yeah, interesting. Corey, do you want to chime in before we go to what I think is our last question?
The only thing I would add is that it's important for government to think quite carefully about what transparency means, just as it's important to think about what consultation means. And it is blindingly obvious from the outcome in this situation that they had a consultation, but that the consultation that they ran was insufficient. There was a need that didn't happen for a much plainer statement of purpose to go to the public, rather than the kind of usual, as I said, very technocratic consultation process that tends to accompany the development and rollout of such policies. That is meaningful transparency. That's meaningful democratic engagement. Actually, the UK government does that pretty well sometimes. Like a lot of very, important policy papers are written in beautifully clear English. It's not as if the skill isn't there. It's just that nobody put the time in.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, our last question gets into a little bit what we were talking about the tension between using probabilistic models around groups and sort of counterbalancing that with a real mindfulness of how these systems affect individuals. So how do we have this experience sort of shape our perspective on the appropriateness of using algorithms, given that in many ways they will at some level be proxying based on group data to make consequential decisions for individuals? How do we think about that in the context of a state and a state's responsibility to its citizens?
I think it's likely to be more legally appropriate and democratically acceptable when you're talking about high-level policy questions, things about, let's say, the distribution of PPE to hospitals or other kinds of things about the kind of flow of aid. You can easily see those being properly informed and influenced by statistical information and aggregate decisions. But when you're talking about something as individual as this, your grade, or let's take other things, whether you are arrested, whether you are given credit, and whether you get a visa. Individual determinations like that, when those are heavily influenced or made by an algorithmic system, you are always going to run into resistance and into problems. People are instinctively resistant to the idea that their future shall be governed in that way. I think it's going to be a very long time before that is overcome. I think so. That would be one kind of principle that I would begin with.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways this is the original sin of kind of any state that is governed by rules. Any any state that doesn't basically administer everything according to a set of individual arbitrary decisions is in a sense setting up a set of rules that will apply to some extent in a generalized way across groups of people. And indeed, the debate about how fair that is and how to balance individual rights against consistency is kind of hundreds of years old sort of political science debate. I guess what's interesting about algorithms is, particularly when you're dealing with machine learning algorithms that are hard to scrutinize, it creates a new domain where we haven't necessarily had those debates about individual rights versus group rights, and it just means that we need our kind of institutional framework needs to keep pace with our technologies.
Yeah. Sophie, anything to chime in there, thinking from sort of a data science perspective in terms of how to engineer these systems?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think statistically anyway, it's always a lot easier to predict effects on groups than individuals, and that's kind of like the starting point that we should be working with, is understanding that and understanding the limitations of the models we're working with. It's true that when we're looking at more complicated machine learning models, then there's even less transparency about what effects that will have and whether it's right to use them and in what ways. I think maybe the field is so young that maybe part of what needs to happen is just more openness and communication, even from the data science field itself, about what they're doing and how it works. Even if it does take time to communicate those ideas, it's really important to start explaining what they're doing and communicate what it is, what the impact might be, even if it's just also to keep it fresh in the data scientist's mind that what they're creating is going to have an impact on people's lives.
Yeah. And also not to focus on harm when it's accrued after deployment, and then responding and then making the improvements after one, harm has occurred, but also it's accrued in places that are much less likely to have the resources and the connections to be able to influence how the system is working. I think the pointing to an appeals process to me feels like at some level a cop out, and we should be very careful sort of when we see an appeals process as necessary but insufficient to actually build just adjudication for whether an individual has been affected negatively. And then we have one more question that's just come in, thinking about how the conversation can be opened more to talk about the goals of algorithms. And I'm going to use moderator prerogative and suggest to frame that around zooming in on, I think, Corey, you just mentioned the sort of logistical purpose of algorithms, and Stian, you gave some examples of how in other areas of government every day these systems can be used to great effect. But could we talk a little bit more about when, in what circumstances, we imagine algorithms being useful, and what the purpose and goal of those systems would be if it was managed appropriately? Stian, I'm gonna.
Sure. So I think I guess this comes back to the question that most of what governments do is about setting rules and principles and applying them. And traditionally, those have not involved quantitative method at all, and there's not been very much data available. So they've often been qualitative rules or laws. Proverbially, we now live in a world where more and more data are available for all sorts of things. So you have this scope where it is potentially possible to administer more things of what we might call algorithms. I think really what we would ideally like is a government that is aware of that is aware of the possibilities of using data science and statistics more generally, because when used appropriately, it can be a powerful tool. It can do things better than qualitative assessment of things, but that looks at things on an ad hoc basis and does it with these kind of questions in mind, like who might this harm? What might be the unintended consequence? How does this algorithm really work? So I think sort of generally we want government to be open, but open in a kind of critical way.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. Others have thoughts? I'd also point to someone shared this with me yesterday, but there's a great piece in the London Review of Books on this situation written by Paul Taylor, and he goes in a bit on how algorithms have been used in the past in university admissions in the UK, and all of the problems that wrought on student populations before this experience. So if you're interested in reading more about sort of historically how these systems have been deployed and to what effect to sort of bake in existing classist and racist perspectives of society, that might be a good place to start if people are interested. And I think we have, so that's it for questions. I think there is a poll of some sort available that we can show that you all have been answering. So yeah, so whoever has the magic poll button, if you can show us what viewers' perspectives have been through the course of this. If you could queue it up, that would be great. Right. So I feel like that kind of sums up this conversations. And thanks so much, Corey and Sophie and Stian. This has been really interesting, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of really complex policy and technical and legal and sort of human problem and challenge. So I assume this is the beginning of the conversation and not the end of it, but I appreciate everyone for joining today and for sharing questions and engaging. So now I think I magically bring someone else in. Da, 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 da. Not this time. Okay, so I guess this is it for us. But thanks for joining and enjoy the rest of your sessions.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.